PhD students have been working on local adaptation to climate variability or El Nino and climate change in Borneo, Kalimantan, and Karnataka in India. He was a co-investigator on the ESPA-funded project, Human Adaptation to Biodiversity Change, 2010 to 2012. We took him to the Western Ghats of India for field research in 2011. He had published dozens of articles, books in Scopus Springers, and another reputable journals. Especially, I remember it's about conservation and social science, beyond critic and co-optation, a case study from orang utan, recent 2000 and 2020 in Reckonly. There's a little bit about his professional activities and publication. I think we need a day to explore all, but I hope we can find out more in 2 hours discussion today with Pak Raj. And please welcome, I don't know how to call, I call Dr. Rajpuri or Pak Raj maybe. Thank you for attention and time to discuss and sharing with us today. I have to tell you that Pak Raj can speak Indonesian, speak Bahasa a little bit. So don't be hesitant to ask or sharing or comment every single things that related with this topic, of course. Pak Raj, we have diverse background of audience, such as college student, lecturer, or government from forestry and environmental department, NGO that concern about ecology, environmental, anthropology, and cultural. Okay, I think that I can tell about Pak Raj. Maybe we can know other things in our discuss. And saya kira saya sudah terlalu banyak bicara juga. I have too much thing, I think. So, Pak Raj, we have 40 minutes to share us about maybe about your recent research in Borneo, Kalimantan. So for all of us, I hope keep your attention and for maybe your question or something that you can share with us in this time with Pak Raj. Okay, I think Pak Raj, please, it's your time to share with us.
Terima kasih banyak, Pak Martin.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Selamat sore. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Pleasure to be back at UNPAD. Many of you may not realize, but Professor Otto Somarwoto was my kind sponsor for my PhD work beginning in 1989, 1990. And so we've had a long relationship through the East-West Center and now through the University of Kent with UNPAD and the Ecology Institute. So it's a great pleasure to be back and to see old friends, even on Zoom. So this talk kind of, in some ways, also charts my own experiences studying the way local communities are adapting both to climate variability, and also now we think of it climate change. So the work that I did in Kalimantan in the 1990s and 2000s captures a particular time when anthropologists were very concerned with a certain way of approaching these. And now my research in India since 2011 captures another phase, a more recent phase in my approach to looking at how local people adapt to the environment, which is basically what environmental anthropologists do in many ways. And I'll have more to say about sort of the overall field. But I just wanted to say that sort of the talk will in many ways sort of reflect my own biography and my own points of view about what I think is important. Of course, there are other points of view, and we can, I'm sure many people have their own, and we can debate those. So I'm just going to share a screen now. I apologize for having PowerPoint slides, but I think it's maybe a little bit more entertaining than just listening to me drone on and looking at my very dark room here in London. So I will just share the screen and okay. Let's see, how does this work? Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today, and some of this will move quickly, is just introduce climate change science and policy, where we are now, talk a little bit about how anthropologists think about the way that they can contribute to climate change science, and then say something about my research in Kalimantan, where we were studying responses to El Nino as a way to look at how people might respond to climate change impacts in the future. So we were thinking ahead about how people might react to the kinds of impacts that were expected. And of course, in Kalimantan, El Nino is a major climatic event, well, all across Indonesia, isn't it? And one of the predicted impacts of climate change, of course, is that the El Nino events will be more extreme. And so that was one of the reasons we were looking at that. And then I moved to Karnataka, to India, on a project looking at how local people were responding to the invasive species lantana camara. And there, that was a very different kind of approach, and a different set of environmental changes that I was looking at. And there worked with a group of people called the Soliga, who are indigenous tribal former hunter-gatherers in the mountains of southern India, and the Lingayat, who are Hindu farmers. So the Penan-Kenya relationship that I looked at in Indonesia was very similar to the Soliga-Lingayat relationship of two different ethnic groups living together, sharing an environmental space. So there's a lot of parallels. And then I'll have some conclusions about where we are and where we're going. Okay. So everyone's probably familiar with this picture of Earthrise, 1968, taken by Apollo 8. Some people say it was the birth of the environmental movement because it showed how we all live on a single planet floating around in space. And just, you can't see any of the boundaries that divide us, nations or ethnicities or religions, classes. And so a lot of people look at this as that moment when we sort of achieved a kind of one world consciousness. And in the late 1960s, we see the birth of the environmental movement. And in fact, even before this picture was taken, Gregory Bateson, anthropologist many of you may have heard of, who worked in Bali in the 1940s, as well as in New Guinea, warned about the greenhouse effect. And the reason that he knew about this was that in the late 1950s, we started monitoring CO2 in the atmosphere in Hawaii, up on Mauna Loa. And we began to chart the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is the major source of data to clue us into the fact that something was happening. And from that, of course, we began then to monitor emissions. And here's the latest I have on emissions. And one of the things that we're acutely aware of is the variability in terms of emissions, where they're coming from, and how these are changing around the world. And of course, then the scientists began to link this rise of CO2 in the atmosphere to changes in the global temperatures, as we all know. And with the rising temperatures, we also have effects on precipitation. So changes in rainfall, in drought, in floods, etc., as a result of the global warming. And then consequent rises in sea level as glaciers and the polar ice caps begin to melt. And so it's those kinds of those kinds of physical events, changes in temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, that are most characterized as climate change impacts. But most of us will probably experience climate change impacts through the more indirect effects that it has on our health, on agriculture, on forestry, on water resources, on coastal areas, and on species and natural areas. So these impacts caused by changes in temperature, rainfall, and sea level rises are what we're most likely are dealing with when we talk about climate change. Now, the climate change building represents, from this picture anyway, you can see it's quite a complicated, multifaceted kind of uh, phenomena, or we could call it an assemblage, to use common everyday anthropology terms, of many different things. It shows that climate change is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary problem, crises that involves many different aspects. But generally, we think of climate change underneath two roofs, one adaptation and the other mitigation. And of course, this talk I wanted to focus on adaptation, but there are plenty of anthropologists dealing with the issue of mitigation. Mitigation is about, of course, reducing emissions to halt the changes that are going on in the atmosphere and those impacts. And we've had various international and policy institutions and treaties to try and achieve that. The Kyoto agreements, the introduction of carbon markets. Now we have the recent pledge for net zero emissions by 2050, and everyone is moving towards that. And of course, at more the ground level, we have civil and civic actions taken by cities, by NGOs like Extinction Rebellion, and universities, et cetera, that are trying to educate people and find ways to reduce emissions. That's all mitigation. I'll have something to say about anthropological contributions to it, but I just want to move on to adaptation. Adaptation is sort of the poor brother of mitigation. Many people think a focus on adaptation is kind of giving up on the possibilities of reversing climate change. But in fact, we're always adapting as humans. We know that as anthropologists. And already there are enough climate change impacts around the world that people are adapting to. And of course, we know now that the impacts of climate change are not evenly distributed around the planet, and that developing countries, low-income countries around the world are likely to have more difficulties adapting to some of these impacts than more highly developed countries. So adaptation also is being addressed at different levels, at different scales. At the international level, we can point to the Adaptation Fund set up by the World Bank, funded by countries, and it provides money to countries like the GEF to fund projects. We might call them often climate proofing projects. In other words, you might have a watershed development or an agriculture project that needs additional funds to ensure that it is climate proofed into the future. And so this is happening at the international level, at the national level. Now we know as anthropologists and others that with every sort of international kind of initiative, there is always a grassroots response, a local response. And we can see this in the various forms. In this case, we can talk about community-based adaptation, which is the sort of the counter action to the International Adaptation Fund. And in this case, the IIED in London has organized conferences every year on community-based adaptation. And a lot of the time, this is about providing resources for communities to adapt to changes that are occurring in their environments. And one of the most successful things they've done is because of modern technology, they have set up means where local communities can communicate with each other around the world and solve problems through knowledge exchange, not having to go through institutions like national governments or the UN. And here's a nice example one, the Arctic Adaptation Exchange set up by the Arctic Council that links communities, practitioners, academia together, and they can, through the internet and through various chat groups, exchange information between Siberia, northern Scandinavia, Canada, the United States, etc. All those Arctic communities can be in working together or exchanging information. So that is an important evolution that we see, and as we know, an important, I think, an important evolution that represents local adaptations and local attempts to adapt to what's going on. Okay, so how have anthropologists been dealing with this? Back about 6-7 years ago, I participated in a seminar where we debated these issues and came up with an article which talked about the contributions of anthropology to climate change science. Okay, so this is about knowledge production. And we thought that what anthropologists offer is a focus on cultural values and political relations, in how these underpin knowledge production, whether it's by the IPCC, by other scientists, by institutions, etc. Knowledge is being produced about climate change, about its impacts, and how is that underpinned and affected by cultural values and political relations. So that's very much looking at the discourse and where it comes from, deconstructions, et cetera. And there's been a lot of research at the institutional level, sort of studying up, that I'll mention in a minute. Of course, anthropologists, and here we're thinking of anthropology as including archaeology, that, you know, we offer a historical context underpinning climate debates, looking at the history of adaptations and reactions to climate variability over time and how that affects what we are seeing now. So we can offer that. Certainly the archaeologists, many of which look at sort of the effects of dramatic climate events in the past, and how they affected societies. And we can learn from those. I think probably the most obvious and clear impact is that anthropologists take a holistic view of human environment reactions. We think of societies and cultures as highly integrated, and not like disciplines, highly integrated. And that holism means that we look at all aspects of human environment relationships, cultural values, societal structures and norms, differences in belief systems, politics, economics. We see that all together. And so we recognize the interconnections within societies and the interconnections with environments. And that kind of holistic thinking is very important to contribute to thinking about climate change, because climate change isn't the only problem that people are dealing with. And certainly my research in Karnataka has very much been about that, about disentangling the impacts of climate change from everyday life and other problems and other drivers of change, be they economic, political, cultural values, et cetera, that people are dealing with. Climate change isn't the cause of everything. And that's an important message that we need to get across. And we can, again, problems with silos and separating out disciplines. So some of the topics of concern today that anthropologists have been dealing with include looking at the historical role of climate variation, like we did in Kalimantan, looking at El Nino, studying local knowledge, actions and practices around climate change, looking at perceptions and responses to impacts, studying the way traditional and scientific knowledge systems are interacting in the context of climate change, like How do people perceive and make use of weather forecasts, for instance, or predictions? The changing risks due to the combination of climate change and other land use changes and disasters. There's research addressing the underlying causes of climate change, like consumer culture, energy production and resource extraction, and the NGO arguments for behavioral change, such as veganism, for instance. So there are lots of research being done by anthropologists looking, again, this is more along the mitigation lines. There's research on sort of looking at the discourse and representations of nature and climate. You know, how do these drive academic preoccupations with climate change? You know, what underlies environmental groups like Extinction Rebellion? What do we understand by dangerous climate change? Who are climate change deniers and what are they saying and why? So there's that whole kind of research. There's also research on adaptation, on the discourse of adaptation. You know, what does it mean when we think about, as often is the case with the whole discourse on poverty and development, the labeling of, say, indigenous groups or local communities as somehow poor and vulnerable and therefore needing our help. This is important to understand, and to understand how that discourse is affecting, say, international policy, national policy. There are many researchers looking at the limits to adaptation, how the ethics and the socio-cultural aspects of societies may limit the ability to adapt to changes. And this is quite important. You know, it's not that we can mitigate or challenge or meet all the challenges of climate change. There may be things that limit us, and it's important to understand these things. And adaptation pathways. What are the many different ways that people are adapting? And you know, I tend to stay away from the word adaptation. I tend to use the word response. I think adaptation is a long-term thing, and we don't know really what is going to happen into the future. At the moment, we're looking at responses to things like hurricanes and floods and melting glaciers and agricultural change and invasive species, et cetera. And then this whole idea introduced by Laura Nader in the 1960s again, the idea of studying up, not just studying small rural communities, the exotics, the indigenous peoples, but also studying the government institutions that make policy that affect local communities. So we have many anthropologists, my colleagues, such as Jessica O'Reilly, looking at how the IPCC or the UN groups function, how they work, how they make decisions, how knowledge is produced, and what are the kind of social and cultural underpinnings of those kinds of decisions, the way these institutions actually function. And then beginning to examine these new concepts and policies that are being introduced, such as the Green New Deal, or net zero emissions, or this idea of nature-based solutions. These are all big policy solutions that are being proposed, and they have both positive and negative kinds of aspects to them and potential consequences for people and institutions. And anthropologists are interested in how these are being introduced and what the potential impacts might be. Okay. I think one of the more interesting kinds of contributions anthropologists have made, of course, is to the whole notion of adaptation. As I said, I tend to be slightly worried about using the word adaptation because that seems to me, from an anthropological point of view, to often be a long-term kind of process. And it's nice perhaps to think about pathways to adaptation. In other words, not quite there yet, but some people would say we're never really adapted to anything because the environment is always changing and people are always like trying to hit a moving target. You're trying to catch up with things that are going on. So we're always on a pathway to adaptation. And some of these pathways you see in the way people are responding to to climate change impacts. Things like increased mobility, the involvement of exchange networks, rationing, pooling, diversification, intensification, innovation, revitalization. So these are kinds of processes that get put in place, and often anthropologists that are on the ground studying local communities and how they're dealing with environmental change may be able to describe what they're seeing in terms of these different pathways that people are initiating. Okay, so one of the important anthropological contributions, I think, is to counteract this notion that somehow people are just sitting there being impacted by climate change and not reacting. In fact, we know people are responding. They're responding to the kinds of changes in their environment like they always do. Perhaps these are new challenges. And one of the interesting things is to document how people understand what's happening in their environment and what they're doing about it. And to me, that seems like the very basis of what anthropologists tend to do. Okay. So now I want to talk about my two case studies or two bits of research that I did. The work in Kalimantan beginning in 1989, 1990, going through to 2000, the 2000s, with Penan and Kenya peoples of North Kalimantan and the upper Bahau River, which I regret not being able to go to again. It's been a long time since I've been back there. But this study emphasizes a few things: the importance of participant observation, a very key anthropological method, pretty much defines the discipline. The focus on local knowledge of weather and climate variability, I think that's an important subject that anthropologists should focus on, and the beginnings of looking at how people are responding and what kinds of institutions have been evolved to deal with climatic variability, and how our response is organized. And I would argue they're in a sort of hierarchy over time. Okay, so one of the reasons that we, as I said, we're interested in this and looking at El Nino was obviously I was doing research during various El Nino events and I could see what was happening. But we also thought about this kind of climatic variability as potentially indicative of how people might respond to climate change impacts in the future. And this, of course, was echoed by reports in Indonesia from DFID and the World Bank about climate change policy in Indonesia. And so again, the effects of El Nino and the way people had adapted to El Nino, which has been on for thousands of years in the Pacific, South Pacific area, seemed to us to be a good model for looking at the different ways that adaptation to climate change impacts might occur in the future. I'm sure everyone has seen pictures of El Nino impacts. It's 1997, showing the rise in sea levels in the Eastern Pacific and the warming along the coasts of South America, which leads to cooler temperatures in the west there around Indonesia, Australia, New Guinea, drought being the most obvious impacts of El Nino in Indonesia and Borneo, and then accompanied by forest fires, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the impacts of El Nino in Borneo that have been noticed, of course, are the reduction and failure of rain-fed rice crops, the reduction in harvest yields, low river levels, which makes transport difficult, risk of forest fires, we know, and the smog that's caused by forest fires, increased risk of disease, massed fruiting events can often follow prolonged drought, which impacts people's subsistence activities in tropical forests. And then we have kind of the opposite situation during La Niñas, heavy rains and windstorms that cause many local impacts, having to do with, again, with failure of rice crops, with increased dangers for travel, et cetera, et cetera. You can look at all of those. Some are very specific to life in tropical forests and in the interior of Borneo rather than the cities. One thing that we did notice, and everyone has brought to our attention, is the fact that El Nino is quite local in terms of its impacts. And this is one thing that we were able to document. From valley to valley, we had very different kinds of conditions. You didn't get forest fires everywhere in Borneo. You got them only in certain locations, if they weren't already started by other people. But also you had, again, it could be more severe depending on where you are. So it really emphasized the impacts of microclimates and regional differences. That was quite important because, national policies, as we know, can often override local variation. And in this case, that was quite important. You might have areas more severely impacted than others. Again, it sort of reinforces the plea for more attention to local variability, not just at the cultural level and social level, but also environmentally, at the way different, the way climate affects places differently. I'm just going to skip over that. But so here's the Bahau River in flood, as it might be during a La Nina event. So I was working in the interior of what's now North Kalimantan, in the Bahau River area, in what's now the Kayan Mentarong National Park, and with two different communities, the sort of Kenya Badang and the Penan Banalawi, who represent two really different subsistence systems and adaptations to that environment, and different sort of emphasis on different kinds of resources in forests and farming, but have a very close relationship. And one of the things we looked at, of course, was how do Penan and Kenya perceive the climate? Do they understand what climate change is? Do they recognize El Nino as an event? And that was an important aspect of anthropological research, is studying people's local knowledge and perceptions, and the way these different knowledge systems affect people's behavior. That makes obvious sense. And we noticed, of course, that climate is a temporal dimension, change over time, and that people recognize seasons that have different combinations, durations, and intensities of weather, but that change over time was also classified by non-weather criteria, such as changes in the forest phenology, animal migrations, and the agricultural calendar. And so people think about weather in combination with other changes in their environment. And you could put together a calendar of Penan and Kenya seasons to show how all of these things are linked, how rainfall is linked with fruiting in the forest, with migrations, and with the agricultural cycle. And this becomes the basis then for talking to people about how this whole set of relationships is changing and shifting as climate change begins to impact even tropical forests in Borneo. So it was interesting that they really didn't have a category for El Nino, but they did recognize that some seasons had more fruit and other seasons had less fruit. And this is linked to El Nino droughts, where the droughts often will trigger a massed fruiting and produced all the fruit at once. And so this was captured in a couple of concepts of Buah Darak and Buah Unyin. But they didn't necessarily see the drought flood link, that the oscillations between El Nino and La Nina. And they didn't really have means for predicting variation. So that was quite interesting. We know that certainly amongst the Kenya, there's a tradition called Tungan Tau. It's a sort of traditional knowledge about assessing when is the best time for planting rice, for burning rice swidens and planting, and also some predictions of the future weather. And so this kind of weather forecasting did exist amongst the farmers. And there is some hints from Sarawak and other places that there is a tradition of being able to kind of predict the coming rainy season. Although there's, unlike research in Peru, which has this been really documented, this hasn't really been documented. There are hints in the literature that there might have been some traditional knowledge about this, but it's no longer present. So how do, say, foragers or hunting and gathering peoples in tropical forest react to El Nino events or climatic variability. With crop failure, they use their knowledge of wild foods. They may plant small gardens in emergency if rice crops fail. They don't invest a lot in agriculture, so they can move around quickly. They can adapt. They're very opportunistic. They maintain social and economic relationships with various people so they can access resources if need be. And they, in fact, the Penan maintained relations with relatives across the border in Malaysia. And it was always said if things got really bad, they could go across to Malaysia and stay with their relatives. So the hunter-gatherers had a series of sort of adaptation steps that came into play when serious environmental changes were occurring due to climatic variability. Likewise, the farmers, like the Kenya, they also could, for instance, if you had rice crop failure, they could fall back on their knowledge of famine foods, of wild foods. They had lots of knowledge about how to take advantage of low rivers to catch fish. They had a whole system of diversifying swidden locations. So ladungs could be up on the hill or by the river, depending on drought or flood. They had all sorts of backup systems like church fields, community reserves. They could plant fast rice if they needed to. They had other kinds of gardens. So they had a subsistence system full of redundancy and risk reduction strategies. And there's other things that are mentioned here. Trade. They have Tana Ulan reserves for hunting and fishing and collecting. They had access to markets for funds and for access to government stores and relief if need be. And that certainly was the case in 97, 98 during the very big El Nino and the whole crisis at that time. And we really saw it quite clearly, the different steps that people had to take to deal with the worsening crisis over time. So this is one of the things that came out of this research, that people rely, there's sort of a hierarchy of responses as the situation lengthens and gets worse, and people will start with traditional knowledge. They may have already, as we see, different rice varieties that are adapted to different kinds of ecological and climatic conditions that they can fall back on. And so loss of those traditional rice varieties can be really detrimental to future adaptation. They have different fields of secondary crops. They have agroecological zones that are linked by trade. They can have access to international markets for trading forest products. Again, they can appeal to government for food aid. So the old ways of adapting, which might have involved migration or warfare or movement, aren't so necessary anymore. Now there are sort of wider political economic contexts that people can draw on. So they're not so totally dependent on their local knowledge and local environment for adaptation. Okay, so then I moved over to India and began to look in a different situation. Here we have dry deciduous forests of southern India, and working with the Soliga and the Lingayat. And there we were looking at how climate-induced biodiversity change, people were responding to that. And this case study emphasizes the use of participant observation again, but also causal analysis to understand really why, to what extent are people actually responding to climate change impacts. It also emphasizes the complexity of change and the complexity of responses to change. It also demonstrates, again, the importance of understanding human environment systems as holistic, as systemic, with feedbacks. And it also, again, emphasizes that perhaps local knowledge may be limited and not be able to deal with the kinds of climate change impacts that they're going to be facing. So biodiversity change is one of those climate change impacts that hasn't had much attention. But we know that already we're seeing extinctions. Obviously, Extinction Rebellion is based around the whole notion that that climate change is causing extinctions. But we also see explosions of pests and invasive species as a result of changes in climate. We see shifts in the range of species up in altitude, up in latitude, especially with fish, migrations of fish in different environments. We see shifts in phenology, that is the fruiting and flowering cycles. Here in the UK, we have an earlier spring, and people are worried about this asynchrony between pollinators and flowering plants. So these various shifts in biodiversity that are affecting agriculture, but also wild species and wild habitats, et cetera. So, and it's probable that many people will be adapting to biodiversity changes as the main kind of impact of climate change. So the area I've been working on is southern India, right in the middle there in the state of Karnataka, south of Bangalore. And this is on the border with Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So these are the Western Ghats and these hills and the various number of protected areas, tiger reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, where there are lots of people that live in and around them. So it's very similar to work in Kayan Mentarang as well. This is the village of Kombudiki, where I was doing research in the mountains. I have to say, it reminded me a lot of Kalimantan in some ways, although people aren't necessarily growing rice, they grow millet in this part of the world. And a small community of about 700-800 people who grow millets and rice, beans. They've got home gardens, and they collect non-timber forest products like fruit and honey, and harvest wild yams. They have cattle and buffalo and goats and chickens. They sell corn, maize, castor, and sunflower for oil. They go off and work in quarries or plantations to raise money. And they, of course, sell various NTFPs, including bamboo baskets, which you can see a picture of there. Now, what's happened is that Lantana camara, which is a Central American shrub, has invaded the forests of southern India. And I'm sure in Western Indonesia, Eastern Indonesia, in dry areas like Flores, Sumbawa, I imagine those areas also are going to be suffering from lantana because it's all over Australia. It gets into dry, tropical, arid areas, and it's a really invasive, terrible invasive species, probably in the top 5 around the world. And as the climate dries out, as we have monsoon failures in India, lantana spreads. It also likes disturbances. So coffee plantations, tea plantations, deforestation can lead to the influx of lantana camara. Nothing eats it. The leaves are toxic. Some of the fruits can be eaten by deer and birds and spread around. But as you can see in that picture on the right with this woman walking on the trail, it grows 2-3 meters and forms very thick walls and thickets. You can't see anything. You can't, nothing eats it. So it just completely invades the understory. Here you see the Soliga hamlet in Kombudiki, both sides of the roads covered with lantana, and the terraces behind full of lantana. You can't plant anything in them anymore. So what happens is that it outcompetes grasses and herbs. It impacts fauna because it destroys food sources, and it prevents animals from moving around, people and animals from moving around in the forest because that stuff is so thick. And in this forest, we have wild elephants, we have tigers, we have leopards, we have sloth bears, deer, and this causes a lot of problem with unexpected encounters. The people who've lost limbs and been killed due to encounters with wild elephants, cattle who've been attacked by leopards. No tiger attacks yet, but it's causing increased human-wildlife conflict. Okay. So for local people, obviously it impacts the forest resources they depend on, which they use for both subsistence and to sell for money. It makes it difficult to go into the forest because they don't feel safe, and you can't move around very easily. And they graze cattle in the forest. They sort of free natural capital of forest for grazing cattle because most of the land is used for growing crops. It's also had a kind of existential effect on people. They don't know where this lantana came from. They think it's like the devil who has come into their landscape and ruined it. And they worry that they have done something to cause this. Now, this is sort of a moral ecology. You know, when I still remember in 2004 when the tsunami hit Sumatra, many of the communities there thought that the tsunami was a punishment for for not being devout enough in whatever religion people had that was impacted. So some of these natural disasters are often seen as connected to human behavior. Again, this is very important, and anthropologists are very good at elucidating this kind of moral ecology, the idea that what happens in the social world affects the natural world and vice versa. There is an interdependence there. And perhaps the modern West has lost that sense of connection. Anyway, so there's a clear sense of despair, sadness, and fear generated by this kind of change in the environment. And we've seen this in other places around the world, amongst, say, Buddhists in the Himalayas, where the melting glaciers are seen as the gods fleeing the mountains, leaving the people on their own. And local people wonder what they've done to drive their gods away, not understanding the connections between global climate change and the melting of their glaciers. And again, this can have psychological impacts that are important to understand because they do impact the way people respond to these kinds of things. Just a couple quotes, that local people say: when this Lord Shani came in the form of lantana, all other things died off. We fall sick. We can't, but they can use it for manure. It's pretty good. They clear it and make natural fences. And as the elephants and pigs and bears and deer are driven out of the forest and begin to look for food in people's fields, they're using the lantana as fencing to keep the animals out. So that they are making uses, there are responses that are effectively helping to deal with it, but they're also losing access to forest resources. Okay, so what we wanted to do in this research was understand what people were doing. Now, they say that lantana has affected grazing of cattle in the forest. So we wanted to investigate that and get a better sense of how does lantana affect grazing pathways. But we recognize that this was a difficult question because in a way, it doesn't really, it lends itself to confirmation bias. That is, we're looking for an effect. And so we turn the question around. And perhaps this is an important methodological point I want to make in this talk. We turn the question around and say, where do grazers go? And so we have this assumed response, but we're now going to investigate that response and see what its causes are. And we do this because we don't want to assume that what people are doing is necessarily due to our assumptions about what's causing it. And I'll give you several examples of this. So instead, we asked the question, why do grazers go where they go? So we followed grazers around. This is the importance of participant observation. We observed where they went. We learned how to graze cattle. We interviewed people about where they were going and why they were going there. Here's a big tusker elephant hidden in the undergrowth there. That was one of the important impacts on grazing. So what we found is that when we interviewed lots of herders over time, we realized that the grazing, the way that people grazed and where they went in the forest was due to a number of factors. It was due to the weather and the seasons, the health of their livestock, the presence of wild animals, the presence of steep slopes, lantana and where lantana was, where preferred grasses were, how many people were available to graze, what kinds of non-timber forest products they needed, because they would combine these two things, and forest restrictions, which were increasingly being implemented by the forestry department. So what it turned out was that, in fact, lantana is only one of numerous factors that are influencing what people are doing in the forest with their cattle. It's not just due to lantana. And so this approach of turning cause-effect questions around was very important to uncovering the complexity of people's environmental relationships. The other thing people said was that they're getting rid of cattle. It's too difficult with lantana in the forest. And so they're selling off their cattle, they're giving it up. Again, so we asked, well, so how does lantana affect livestock numbers? We then had to turn that question around and say, why do people have fewer cattle? And again, this goes from the response to the causes of that response. And in fact, when we did surveys and we did inventories, we found that many households have indeed come down from 20 to 100 head of cattle to none, or maybe between 0 and 5 and between 10 and 20. So it was a dramatic drop in the number of cattle in the last 2 generations. And we've seen this in Karnataka as a whole. Over time, the number of cattle people are keeping in their villages is dropping. And this is quite important because the sacred cow is such a key to rural life in India and has been for thousands of years. So we asked then, what are the causes of the decrease in the number of cattle? So you can imagine we sat down with somebody and said, how many cattle do you have? How many goats? How many buffalo? How many did you have 10 years ago? What's happened? Why did you change? What's going on? And people said some of their cattle were killed by leopards or other creatures. There was increasing forestry department regulations that made it more difficult to go into the forest. They could be fined because the area has become a wildlife conservation, wildlife sanctuary. People are starting to go off to do wage labor. And so there wasn't enough people to graze the cattle. So that was another reason given. People said they were having smaller families. So there were, again, fewer people to graze cattle. And there were new occupations that people wanted to engage in, especially young people who wanted to move to the cities, who wanted to get jobs, who didn't want to be stuck in the village grazing cattle every day. So when we actually looked at why people had reduced the number of cattle, we realized that, again, lantana was just one of many different kinds of factors that was being that was involved here. There were cash needs that people had. There were smaller families. There was a devaluation of rural life, urbanization, forest restrictions, migration. All of these were leading to fewer cattle. So it was a much more complex picture of environmental change coupled with economic change, coupled with cultural change, and political policy change, et cetera. Another thing that we realized was, in fact, some people actually had more cattle than they led on to. And after the harvest, there was suddenly an influx of cattle into the village, and people brought cattle from the lowlands where they had outsourced their care to other people and brought it back into the village to graze in the harvested fields. So what was happening was that because of the difficulties of finding forage due to lantana and other factors, people were sending a lot of their cattle to people, paying people to take care of them in the lowland areas, and only bringing them back to produce manure for their fields for the next harvest season. So this is a kind of outsourcing. So when we put this together in sort of a causal analysis here, we realize that there are a number of causal histories that lead to fewer cattle in the community. It's not just lantana invasion or climate-induced biodiversity change that people are responding to. They are responding to changes in family size, changes in the value of rural life, changes in the desires of young people to change professions, to move to cities, the availability of cash, jobs, as well as the environmental changes caused by lantana, caused by drought and climate change, et cetera. And you can see how these things interact and synergize to mean that there's less cattle in the communities. Okay. So again, this kind of causal analysis, I think, is really key when we look at adaptation and as anthropologists. We can observe what people are doing, but we have to go backwards in our thinking and ask, what are the causes of what it is that we're observing people doing? Because climate change may just be one of many different factors that is influencing what people are doing. And it's often the case that people never do something for just one reason. There are often multiple reasons that lead to changes or responses or adaptations, and not just climate change. Climate change, in fact, may be a catalyst for changes that are already occurring in a community or in a human environment relationship. So I hope you've been able to follow along with this. So anthropology has a lot to offer climate change science. We are focused on local knowledge and understandings of climatic and environmental change is quite important. And there we're talking about the changes or this knowledge of the past, present, and future. Local responses to change. How are people perhaps generating new knowledge? This is very important for providing an understanding of what's happening at the local level, at the grassroots, to contribute to policy at the upper levels as well, and also to be able to meet that policy coming from the top. We focus on cultural values and social factors and how those influence responses. We emphasize the complexity of human environment systems, the fact that there are multiple drivers. We also emphasize the importance of being there, of doing participant observation, of actually observing and discussing with people what's happening and developing methods to understand why people do what they do. And I've left this to perhaps discussion as to, does anthropology have a role beyond academia, beyond the production of knowledge? And I'll leave that perhaps for questions or discussion. So thank you very much for listening to me droning on like this. I hope it's been interesting and happy to take questions and comments. I'm going to turn off my screen now.
Baik, thank you, Pak Raj, for your describe about that we hear till now. And now we go to discuss, and I give one chance to three questions maybe. Pak Raj, they can ask you with bahasa or in English.
Boleh bahasa.
Oke.
Kalau saya masih ingat.
Iya, iya. Nah, kita bantu Pak Raj.
Ya.
Ya, silakan untuk 3 penanya untuk segmen pertama, boleh silakan.
Mas Fadli, saya boleh tanya?
Silakan Pak, silakan. Sebut
Ya.
boleh sebut nama dari mana gitu.
Saya
Yunita
bawa.
di situ, Pak.
Bisa?
Silakan.
Oh, please.
Ya.
Pak Suryo ya, Pak Suryo.
Suryo Adi Wibowo atau Bowo.
Ya.
Saya dari Bogor.
Ya Pak, silakan Pak.
I'm sorry late to join. You already 20 minutes when I joined. It is interesting because many social science are late to understand the phenomenon of the climate change, and they thought that this is the business of the meteorological guys. or the agro-meteorology guys. This is not our business. That's I think your contribution is interesting, you know. And I several times discuss with anthropologists and as well as sociologists, and they said that. Oh, and my comment is, hey guys, this is everybody business, not only the discipline of the meteorologist, something like that. Particularly, this is also the responsibility of the social science, how to cope the problem, you know, how to prevent the problem, particularly to the rural areas that they don't know, because their local knowledge are crammed into the local situation.
Need a professional website? I created one for our startup using Wix. Let me show you how.
Somebody's.
My question is that regarding the Kenya in a Kalimantan, you mentioned that they have international trade, yeah? With the others, I mean. But according to FIDA, they already make international trade with the other region since perhaps in the 19th centuries, yeah. According to there has been a long time ago. And my question is that did the relation already changes right now? And perhaps difficult to say that if it is changes, it is because of the climate change or perhaps because of the land use change, something like that. I think the international trade between the local people in Dayak Kenya and Punan changes significantly, not because of the climate change, but because of the land use change, the landscape changes, the kelapa sawit enter to the area, something like that. Yeah, this is quite interesting to see that. And regarding your last question, that how the anthropologists may contribute beyond the science, I think this is very interesting because I several times attend the COP, the Conference of the Parties.
All right.
Since the Paris Agreement. But then it is really strong dominance of the, I said, hard science compared to the social science. So how, and I ask again to you, how the social science could bring more information. There is also Bu Yunita. Hello, Bu Yunita. This is also Bu Yunita, I think, is one of the anthropologists that also concerned with the agriculture and also the farmer. So I think it is the best time to make what you call it a regional international meeting that dedicated for the anthropological point of view or sociological point of view, how we should deal the climate change issues. I think it is still quite limited action from the social science. Although in the report of the IPCC, there is also a section of the social science, but then meeting or conference where social science contribute significantly are still very limited compared to the science. So I think my question is not only to Raj, but also to Bu Yunita. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Let me just clarify that in my reporting about Kenya adaptation, it wasn't necessarily a study of how people are responding now, but it's about the development of a long-term set of adaptive strategies to deal with the impacts of El Nino events over time. So yes, absolutely, the international trade is very important, but it's a very old adaptation that is still there today as a means of dealing with, say, how do we get cash to buy rice from our neighbors that we can't trade with anymore, or from farther away? Well, we can go collect rattan, we can sell baskets, we can collect garu, etc. So that's what I was trying to say. I don't, it'd be interesting because I haven't been there in a while, but in the last 10 years, I know with Klapasawit and that on the coast, that's had dramatic impacts on people's access to resources and probably what they can trade. I mean, when I was there, the little longan fruit, mata kucing, suddenly became a viable commercial product, because so many people had moved from the interior to the coast, and suddenly you had demand for something that was never traded commercially. And so that became a commodity. It became something that people could make cash with just in the mid 1990s. I mean, it wasn't very long ago. Maybe for some of you that seems like ancient history, but so I would be interested to know what's happening now in terms of this. It's interesting because people don't really pay much attention to tropical forests when they think about climate change.
Right. And right now, illegal mining are spread in the hinterland. My student just a few months ago studied there, and it was very interesting. The local, as well as the Kenya, they join off in illegal gold mining. It's very bad. Okay.
Yeah. Well, economic things. But in regard to the second question about being involved, yes, anthropologists, I think, have a good role to play. I mean, I've always thought about anthropologists as potentially, yes, producing knowledge and being a scholar, but also we're educators, aren't we? We're educators, and we can teach not just our students, but the public. We can write for a public audience.
Exactly.
Sometimes we can play a role as a mediator, a cultural broker, a translator for people. And I think that may be an important role. And lastly, we can be activists. We can work with people to help them. And in India, we've been working with those communities to try and secure rights to access resources from the forestry department. We've been trying to develop with the forestry department there rules about, within this new wildlife sanctuary, access to resources. And we've been working with things like, we set up a nursery to grow wild medicinal plants and food plants that were being impacted by lantana, and people are now planting these into their gardens. So this is a response to the damage that's lantana is causing in the forest. So I think, there are ways that we can get involved beyond just doing research. But these have to be very locally determined by what local people want. And perhaps, we have to match up our actions by what other people say is important to them. And that's part of what our research is about. Is trying to understand what people are thinking and what's their problem and what they need to see happen.
And one last question. This is the question actually. In the last 5 years, I coordinate what you call it, the Pojok Iklim. Pojok Iklim is under the Council of the Climate Change. It was under the Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan. So every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, 1:30, actually, every Wednesday we making a regular discussion from many kind discipline, from many kind non-parties, NGOs, farmer, businessmen, and then this is already works for 5 years. So I will invite you, if you don't mind. I will invite you to speak in our forum.
I have to bone up on my Indonesian.
No problem. Campur saja, campur.
Yeah.
Campur. If you don't mind, Pak Fadli or our moderator, you can send through chat your email, etc., or your address,
Yeah.
can I
Sure.
you later on?
That's easy enough to find. I'm all over the web.
Thank
you.
Oke, mungkin selanjutnya Bu Yunita ya. Silakan Bu Yunita.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, Adi, I just would like to to also answer the questions of does anthropology have a role beyond academia? So you already raised that question, yeah. So thank you. First of all, I would like to introduce myself as I already mentioned by Prof. Adi, that I'm also an anthropologist, a human ecologist also, and I'm also a student of Professor Faida. So I have been facilitating farmers to cope with the climate change, the coastal climate change since 2008. So it is 12 years already in an interdisciplinary approach and transdisciplinary. So more a collaborative ethnography like that. So just an introduction. So I'm happy with your presentations. It's like reminding us that we can do a lot of things, yes, not only studies, but also what you mentioned later. So as I told you, the anthropology can, I begin with that, move beyond academia, like you said, an activist, etc. Like what I did is I tried to practical, go to facilitate farmers directly, but of course, climate issue and agronomics is not my what you call it training, yeah, academic training. So an interdisciplinary is a must. So if anthropology would like to move further, not only doing a research as an ethnographer, then yes, Prof. Adi, maybe we need to open up ourselves, and also the other disciplines should also invite us like that, yeah? Open up your windows also for us like that to have collaboration. So why it is not many among anthropologists? Because anthropologists cover so wide range of studies, yeah? And those who choose to focus on environmental anthropology, maybe only one or two or three, and then especially on climate change. So of course, we are left behind with our other fellow scholars. So I agree with that. So my question is that like this, when you frankly told us that you did your study, I think almost 20 years ago or more than 10 years ago, yeah? So, when you talked about the India, the what is called, sorry, forgot again the name, India, and you talk more about lantana intervention, yeah? So I'm just thinking about how do the people, if you make I know that maybe you do not want to make a comparison, but when you talked about Kenya and then you talked about India, I was thinking that you also study their responses to El Nino, for example. So if their responses to El Nino, what are the similarities with the Kenya? What are the differences in Kenya? But when you talk in detail about the responses to lantana, then I was thinking about what Professor Adi mentioned about the intervention and the change of landscapes from rainfall forest into oil palm plantations. Yeah, and so it's changed their lives, of course. So I think in the past 10 years or so, probably the landscape, the tradition already changed. And how do they have to cope within their maybe narrower habitat, maybe change habitat into the climate change issue, which have been already complicated with the change of landscapes. So I just wondered whether you also observed the Indian people, farmers' responses to climate change, and how you find the similarities and differences with the Kalimantan, Kenya people. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. So we see lantana invasion as one of the impacts of climate change, but it's affecting the biodiversity. So whereas we might see the effects of variation in climate in Kalimantan affecting, say, agriculture, because say rice crops fail, or some other agriculture. Again, we're still talking about how weather impacts plants, and whether it means crop failure or it means invasive species. So in that way, they're very similar. One is a long-term impact that, as I said, that the Kenya have developed risk reduction strategies, such as multiple ladangs, such as different varieties of rice. So people have been living with El Nino for a long time. So they have built into their subsistence system a series of adaptive strategies that help to deal with somewhat unpredictable El Nino impacts. And in India, you have the annual monsoon. The annual monsoon can fail with El Nino. I mean, that's actually how they discovered El Nino, is because somebody studying the failure of the Indian monsoon traced it back to these changes in the South Pacific, the ENSO. So these things are connected. And people do talk about the failure of the monsoon. But in this area, again, local variation here is important. They don't suffer the kinds of failures of monsoon that you see in the lowlands in India. This is up in the mountains. They have a better kind of a more moderated climate. It's actually not that hot. It doesn't really look like the images you think about of India. I was very surprised, in fact. It's more wet, it's more moist. It doesn't have that kind of impact. But yes, people do have occasional failures of the rains, and they would also rely on the collection of non-timber forest products, what's broom grass, bamboo for baskets, fruit, lichens. There's a lot of the Ayurvedic traditional medicine. Those forests provide a lot of products, a lot of species that go into Ayurvedic medicine, and that's very old trade. That's also a sandalwood forest, and like Garu, although it grows much more in much greater dense, so people would trade sandalwood. So again, you have a similar kind of fallback on wild species for food and medicine, a similar fallback on commodities to be traded for cash or for other foodstuffs in these kinds of emergencies. So in many ways, they do have similar kinds of responses. They don't have the mobility aspects, perhaps, that the Kenya and the Penan might have had, because the density of people is much higher. We're talking about much smaller territories, whereas in Kalimantan, I mean, the kampung was huge, and the amount of land available to people was absolutely enormous, in terms of being able to move around and find different resources. And but in this area, they're much more constrained in where they can go. So trade was quite important. So in many ways, they are similar. And the kinds of impacts that we're seeing now with the failure of rains, the drought, this is affecting India dramatically. And you have all sorts of traditional rainfall capture techniques that are being reinvigorated, revitalized is the word. And part of these climate proofing projects often is about rainfall capture, because unlike Indonesia, they get rain, at one point in the year, and that's it. And it just comes down in huge amounts, and you have to capture it and hold it in these underground water containers, basically, or in the ground itself to keep the wells going and to be used for irrigation. In many places where you do have piped irrigation, the traditional rainfall capture techniques have disappeared. People have forgotten about them, but these are being revitalized. And often you will see that's an important adaptation, is to fall back on traditional knowledge to build these rainfall capture systems to capture the monsoon rains that can carry them through drought periods. I hope I've answered your question. You're mute.
What is your role in this? farmers' own initiatives to reinvent? Is it based on farmers' own initiatives to reinvent their tradition,
Yeah.
or did you role
Well,
also?
in many places, it did start with people finding support because these kinds of things are big infrastructures, like constructing terraces. So it requires a lot of labor. But in many cases, we have evidence that yes, there was some memory of these systems, and people have convinced others to go ahead and let's redo this. And then when success occurred, NGOs and governments have taken that model and then begun to teach other people. So in many cases, it is farmer-led revitalization of traditional practices that had disappeared. And there's different names for it in different parts. But I can send you a website on tipping points where there's some nice films about this in different parts of like Rajasthan, which is very dry, a desert area. But once the success was shown, NGOs have picked this up, and now it's made it into government policy and agricultural development policy, and so it's being spread around. It kind of makes obvious sense, but it does require maintenance, like an irrigation system, like paddy systems in Indonesia. You need people to clean it, to maintain it. And again, the same problem with cattle. If everyone's leaving the villages and you have smaller families, then who's around to maintain these very labor-intensive kinds of systems? And so people are falling back on pipes and irrigation systems and water tanks and other kinds of rainfall capture. So some of the traditional knowledge just it's not possible to actually do it anymore. Although there are plenty of places where they are trying to use this old technology to capture rainfall.
Thank you.
Baik, mungkin kalau tadi sudah dari akademisi, mungkin kita ke mahasiswa atau dari NGO atau pemerintahan gitu, silakan.
Boleh, Pak.
Can I ask?
Oke. Siapa dulu?
Siapa dulu?
Okay.
Pick somebody.
I think it's my turn, right? Okay. Sorry. And thank you, sir, for the presentation. But actually, I'd like to ask you some questions. I'm not an anthropologist or anthropological student. I'm a law student, but I do interest in anthropology and ecological and something. But what I like to ask you is, what kind of policy? I'm a law student. I mean, I took this special course in environmental law and yeah, something like that. And what kind of policy that we need to fight the climate change? I mean, these climate change are very, very. I think it's detrimental, and it's have a lot of impact that to our country. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, huge.
So what kind of policy? What kind of policy that we need? Because there's a lot of policy before this. I mean, before the last policy. I mean, the omnibus law, like the Kyoto Protocol ratification or anything that have a relation into the environmental, but it doesn't change anything. I think the policy in Indonesia, it doesn't change anything. So what kind of policy do we need to fight this climate change or anything? Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Evan. Good question. Really good question. I'm glad you're studying environmental law. I often thought that, and my old friend Sandra Moniaga, who you may have heard of, is a great person to get in touch with about this. It's the same with forestry and we can have lots of good laws, but if they're not implemented or enforced, then what's the point, right? So finding ways to enforce very good laws, which Indonesia has, and very good policies in many cases they have, to how to enforce them and actually implement them is often a big issue. Another thing for environmental law is, the protection of people. I mean, one of the issues that the implementation of climate change policies, we don't want to have the problem of them creating inequalities or, like the whole red thing, red plus policies that might lead to impacts on poorer rural people. Again, so I think in many cases, the legal community, it would be very important that environmental policies square with human rights policies and land rights policies. Again, this shows the complexity we're talking about here. When we deal with the responses to climate change, we don't want to create other problems in other sectors, whether it's economics, human rights, land rights, etc. So I think you're in a good position. I really, sometimes I wish I had become a lawyer, because I think sometimes, although they don't have a very good reputation, I think it's really necessary that as we go forward, policies that are adopted are implemented, and they're implemented in a way that doesn't cause worse problems. And so I really encourage you to keep going, pursue this stuff, and work locally. I think solving local problems is really the way to go, whether it's often protecting the land rights of local people. As we've seen around the world, recent reports from the CBD and IPBES and others have shown that local people preserve a lot of biodiversity in their lands. And the more protection we have for land rights and land tenure, the more likely we are to protect biodiversity, and the more likely we are to have the resources and the knowledge to deal with climate change impacts.
Thank you, sir, for the answer.
Oke, ada lagi yang ingin bertanya?
Saya mau tanya. Oh, halo.
Silakan.
Ya, oke. Sebelumnya saya ingin bertanya dan minta maaf karena I can't turn on the camera. So sorry.
Oh,
so
okay.
I am Salsabila. I am a student from Pajajaran University studying anthropology, and I back to the local knowledge part. Yeah, I was interested in the local knowledge and response from the Kenya Badeng people, and I curious about, do you also look or research about the maybe distribution of knowledge and responses based on the maybe social economic classes or level of education and maybe gender role? Is there any different level of knowledge between them, or is it just homogeneous? And is it important for us to look at this point? Okay, maybe that's all my questions. Thank you so much.
Excellent point. Absolutely. I totally agree with you, and I apologize for not mentioning it. But yes, one of the most important things that anthropologists document is the variation in knowledge and responses amongst people. And I kind of glossed over that for the sake of brevity, but you're absolutely right. What men and women know is often very different, and the way they respond is often very different. Certainly we see that in India. Amongst the Kenya, I found the Kenya and the Penan to be a much more kind of egalitarian society in terms of roles played by both men and women. Often were very similar. There's a lot of sharing, but there's definitely different emphasis and different levels of expertise. Certainly knowledge of wild plants, and the access to wild plants was very much women's knowledge. And in India as well, women know a hell of a lot more about medicinal plants and wild plants, and they're the ones who are really impacted by lantana. Amongst the Kenya as well, we have dramatic differences in ages. Older people obviously know a lot more than younger people, but also younger people are not as interested. They're going to schools, they're leaving communities, they're not being educated in the way that their parents and their grandparents were. And so there's a real problem with, not problem, but there's a real phenomena of loss of traditional knowledge in communities. But absolutely, I think, one of the big mistakes that development studies and conservationists and other groups of professionals that interact with local communities, one of their biggest mistakes is to not recognize the differences within a community, just to think of the community as one homogeneous thing, whereas there are leaders with more political power, there are levels of poverty within the community that may be different. There are differences between men and women and young and old. And any good methodology that is implemented in communities, such as the work we did with C4 on the multidisciplinary landscape assessment project, needs to take account of that variation. So thank you very much for reminding everyone of that very important point.
Oke, baik. Terima kasih buat pertanyaan dan jawaban yang sudah disampaikan. Thank you for your answer, Pak Raj. Kita beri kesempatan untuk yang belum bertanya, silakan. Mungkin 3 penanya lagi ya. Waktu kita sisa 30 menit lagi. Silakan buat 3 penanya.
Let's see.
Saya boleh bertanya?
Ya.
Tadi Viet.
Silakan.
Yes. Have chat that I wrote. So it's basically, sorry, introduce myself. Yeah, my name is Arziana Sunkar. You can call me Ina. I'm from IPB University in Bogor. Yeah, and in one of your slides, you wrote that food varieties are also caused by climate change. And I was wondering, because currently we are doing a research in Gayo Highland in Aceh, and looking into the relationship between the language and plant conservation. And we found that there are many varieties of local bananas and oranges. But when we look into the local names, some of them are influenced by Bahasa Jawa and Bahasa Sumatra from other parts of Sumatra. So I was wondering whether these varieties were caused by migration, or is there a possibility that it's also caused by climate change, because some species cannot be found there anymore while others, or perhaps you can give insights into what we can do, because this is supposed to be a 3 years research, and this is just the end of 1 year research, perhaps, so that we thought that it could be because of migration. Since you're from anthropology, perhaps you can also give insights on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ina. Yeah, because you typed your question there. It was so long. I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to have time to answer it. So I'm glad you've asked me. I'll look at it. I'll think about it a little bit. But just off the top of my head, absolutely. I think, when you look at varieties, plant varieties, obviously, looking at local names is a very good clue as to where they might come from and what they might be for. You'd have to talk to people there. I think you'd have to just interview farmers about where they got these varieties from and see if you can trace where they came from. They may have been brought into that area because, yes, they actually do quite well there because they're somewhat pre-adapted to that climate. They may have been brought into that area because people like them, because they taste good, or because they're commercially viable. you know, it's difficult to say unless you start to go in there and just ask a bunch of people that are growing them about, you know, about where they came from. That's what I would recommend. Yes, I mean, obviously that's an absolutely important point, that not climate change doesn't cause everything, as we know. We know that rice varieties, for instance, there are many rice varieties in Kalimantan that are adapted to drought conditions or wet conditions. But there's also rice varieties like black rices and red rices that are grown for ritual purposes, for weddings, to make arak and beer and other kinds of drinks. You know, so there are multifunctional, multi-causal factors in the kinds of varieties that people develop over time. And they may borrow them from other groups because they satisfy local needs. So understanding the local values and what people need and what they want, what they prefer, is really critical in all aspects. I think that's what anthropologists do quite well. Again, showing that variation and the different kinds of values that underpin people's choices. But from an ethnobotanical point of view, I think you just got to go in there and start talking to people, and do some, you know, develop some interviews with a variety of different people about where they got their varieties from, and why they use them and what they use them for. And maybe you'll come up with some clues. But of course, people trade varieties all over the place, you know, and they borrow and learn from each other. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you have things that with foreign names.
Okay, but with climate change, how far back should we ask them? Like in order to know whether it is also, whether there's a possibility is it caused by climate change or not?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to combine it with some assessment of what people think is happening to the weather. And you know, again, these timelines are very helpful. You know, you kind of do a timeline and pick some important events in the last 50 years, last two generations, and see to what extent people can describe what the climate was like or what weather was like then. Do they remember? And then maybe you can associate then agricultural changes with that. But you have to be careful. You don't want to put words in people's mouths, right? You just kind of let them talk about it. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing when you look at this kind of causal analysis approach, you don't want to presume what the cause is. You don't want to presume that it's climate change. But if you go backwards, how did you get this variety and why did you take it? You will then see to what extent climate change plays a role in their decision making. Or, you know, because somebody could say, well, I found out that this variety does really well in dry conditions, so I got it, or I brought it, or somebody introduced it and it does well. You know, I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, there may be sort of an unconscious shift to species that do well under drier conditions. And that may be a kind of natural selection that's going on, but you wouldn't expect it with dramatic kinds of changes. But again, it depends on how climate change is playing out in that particular environment. What does it mean to say climate change impacts in Aceh, in the upper mountains of Aceh? It's like in Kalimantan, you know, what is it actually, how does it manifest itself there is the first question. You know, is it just mean that some years you get more drought and other years you get more rainfall? Is it affecting the fruit and flowering system, the synchrony? You know, you have to ask people about all these kinds of things to get a sense of how climate change is affecting a particular area, because it may not be in a very obvious sense. You know, it's dramatic when we look at the Arctic area and we see melting ice caps and the permafrost and the melting glaciers in the Himalayas and sea level rise in the islands in Indonesia and in the Pacific. But in tropical areas, it's sometimes not so easy to ascribe variation as due to climate change. You just kind of have to ask about change in general and ask about what people are doing and see to what extent those things are connected without making any assumptions ahead of time. Hope that helps.
Thanks. Thank you.
There was somebody else who had a
Thanks
question.
for. Ya, apakah masih ada lagi? Anyone else wants to ask questions? We lost Mas Fadil because of the connection, so I take over his position now.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I'd love to hear from students about what they're doing, their research projects.
Yeah, ada lagi? Students? Anyone? Please. Hello?
Don't have to.
Ada Mbak Anggi? Mbak Anggi, are you there?
Okay.
Anggi
I need to
Irawan.
unmute first.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry,
Not
Mas
that.
Anggi. Okay, Mas Anggi.
It's okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Wait a minute. Okay. I'm in outside right now and still freezing now. My name is Anggi. I'm in Budapest right now. So interesting topic, Prof. Rajendra Puri. And sorry, not really stable here.
That's
So
okay. Go ahead.
I wanna share my previous research about climate change, also related with health. I have research in Sukurimba in Jambi. One of my results, it was interesting because in the past 10 years, malaria disease in there happening, and there is some outbreak because deforestation or something like that. Is it so? How the indigenous people cannot unable to adapt, but a bit different with your presentation. They can adapt, but in my research, they can unable to adapt, and the outbreak of disease related with the malaria, also climate change, also deforestation, also the new policy of the government. That's my previous research. But another thing, I have question to you, Prof. Rajendra Puri, related your research in Kalimantan. What is your research background? Why you choose Kalimantan, especially in Indonesia? Okay, but it's a really interesting and fascinating topic. But I didn't follow well your presentation, but it's really great. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Let's see. I'm interested in this problem in Jambi. Did they not have malaria before?
In Jambi is like there is a place. The name is Bukit 12 in the forest. There is the like change from the previous natural forest to the palm plantation right now.
Yeah. But you said there was an increase in malaria?
Yeah, there's outbreak in the past, I think 10 years, outbreak of malaria because the deforestation and the change the environment. One of my finding like that.
Did they not have malaria before?
0 case on 1980, and then I did study on 2016, and there is some outbreak in Sukurimba, like the indigenous people in Jambi.
Well, I mean, this is one of the big impacts of climate change, isn't it?
Yes.
That we're having outbreaks like the ticks here that carry Lyme's disease are moving northward and becoming more prominent. So, and I'm sure, you know, there's the worry about malarial, the range of malarial mosquitoes moving as well.
Yes.
In Southern Europe, there's a real worry about that. So that's a big, you know, the effects of climate change on disease, as we've seen with coronavirus, are quite important, and a quite important impact that that needs much more attention, certainly. But I'd be, yeah, I think studying how local people are reacting to that would be quite important. I would imagine they might not know, they might do something. It might be some kind of response, or maybe, you know, they will get on the internet and try and figure out what to do. I don't know. But that seems like a very good research topic. Now, as far as Kalimantan goes, gosh, you have to go way back when I was an undergraduate. I studied for a year in Australia, and went to work, did some research in New Guinea, in Papua New Guinea, in 1984, and that's when the rainforest movement began, really. And so I was so interested in Irian Jaya, actually, in Papua.
Papua.
So that's how I went. Then I ended up in Hawaii studying for my PhD, learning Indonesian, meeting a lot of Indonesians who are at the East-West Center in Hawaii, and then you know, wanting to go to Indonesia to do research in Irian Jaya. But then politically, that was impossible. And so friends of mine who had been working in, like Pete Vida and all, who'd been working in Kalimantan, recommended I go there instead. And I worked with WWF and UNESCO in this area that then became the Kalimantan National Park. So, so it's very serendipitous, you know. You end up in, sometimes difficult to predict where you're going to end up, or what's going to happen to you. But I'm very glad I did. You know, very happy to.
Yeah. Okay, thank
Great
you.
place, actually.
Thank you, Pak Raj.
Anyone else?
We still have 8 minutes to go. Anyone else? It's getting darker here, where in your place it's getting lighter, Pak Raj.
Yes, it's starting to get lighter. Although we have absolutely terrible weather. It's just been raining and dark and cold.
Oh, okay.
So I'm really missing
typical London, but
at this time of the year. I very much miss Indonesia.
we have maybe one last questions from our alumni. Fuad, please.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Erna, for the time. And thank you, Pak Raj, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Fuad. I'm formerly student of anthropology, but now I am work as a lecturer in sociology department. And maybe I would like to share a little bit of my previous research. So I was working on the West Papua in 2017 to study about the ecological and social consequences in the context of sagu industrialization. So there is many of course, stimulating from the process, and I like to mention about the differences about the topic about how we have to aware about the heterogeneity of the knowledge among the community, even that the community is relatively small, and that I have one problem that I have faced in the community is about the difference of knowledge about the ecosystem regarding to the generation. So there are different generations have different knowledge about the ecosystem, about the plants, the animals, and so on. And then in the context of changing political economy and social change, there are also different aspirations in the community itself. For instance, when there are a corporation try to build the development of industrialization in this location, the older thing that to protect the forest is on top of the priority. But for the younger generation, they see that the presence of the corporation will bring more money than before. So it's very interesting for the younger. And then the problem is how the anthropologists or us have to deal with those kind of different aspiration in the local community itself when we see, for another example in another context, that let's say industrialization will make an ecosystem change and so on. So that it's a kind of problem for me. And related to your presentation in India, is there any kind of problem like that, and how you deal with those kind of problem? Maybe just that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the big issues, of course, is intergenerational change. You know, there's in rural parts of the world, all over the world, here in Kent, in the UK, in Spain, where I've been working, wherever my students work, young people don't want to stay in communities anymore. They want to move to the city. You know, and they want a different life from their parents. You know, they want a quote modern life and or a city life. And that's happening everywhere. I mean, urbanization is a massive movement of people, right? It's accompanied by what we call rural flight, people leaving the rural areas. So the perpetuation of certain traditions becomes very difficult with reduced populations. You know, automation in farming can have the same effect. As you don't need many people to do a lot of farming things. We've seen that here in the UK and other places. Yeah, so you have this big demographic shift occurring and an intergenerational shift. And I mean, obviously, as an anthropologist, we're interested in how different people are responding to that and how they perceive it and why they're doing what they're doing about it. I think in India, in that village, there were a few young people who decided to stay, and they were grazing cattle. And in many ways, the fact that so many people had left meant that actually there was now less pressure on the remaining resources. And so you could have a few families with 10 to 20 cattle grazing them in the forest every day. And that could perpetuate that tradition and that knowledge and that way of life. And that was possible because so many people had in fact left. So you talk about variation within the community. You know, not everyone was giving up cattle, and not everyone was leaving the village. There were still a few that were there, but the general trend was movement away. But in some cases, that was beneficial to others. You know, again, a more complex picture there. The ability to outsource cattle to somewhere else, to give it to somebody else to take care of, also meant that some people could maintain this kind of rural traditional way of life. So I think it's just important to document that variation and to try and understand what's driving it. You know, keep asking why. You know, why are these people, you know, why are young people interested in this? So the commodification or commercialization of sagu production, that's interesting. So they're like producing sagu flour biscuits and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You guys can always, I'm happy to take emails and questions. If for those of you who are shy to ask questions, so just send me, drop me a surat and that'll be fine.
Oke, bagi yang mungkin belum sempat bertanya karena waktunya habis, tadi Pak Raj menuliskan alamat emailnya di chat, jadi boleh kontak Pak Raj langsung untuk bertanya. Thank you, Pak Raj. It's very interesting talk and discussion, but our time is running out. It's almost 5 here, and maybe we can continue in the next session. I think this is not the last, because maybe we will invite you again for another lecture. And we would like to invite especially postgraduate students who is doing research on climate change or environmental anthropology. Hope you don't mind somewhere in this year. Baik, Bapak Ibu, thank you. Terima kasih sekali atas kehadirannya. masih banyak mungkin yang ingin bertanya, tetapi waktunya sudah habis, jadi bisa mengirimkan ke email Pak Raj, tadi ada di chat ya, di paling atas tadi, atau mungkin nanti bisa email ke kami dan kami akan share email Pak Raj ke semuanya. Terima kasih sekali atas kehadirannya, semoga bermanfaat. Thank you very much Pak Rajendra Puri for your time and fascinating information. See you maybe sometimes, and stay safe and healthy there in UK, and
You too. You too.
safe and healthy for all of us here in Indonesia. Thank you. Selamat sore and selamat pagi waktu Inggris. Terima kasih, sampai jumpa. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.